Erik Lonnquist, alias DoA, is an esports commentator known for his time in premier broadcasts of League of Legends and Overwatch, and known to many viewers as a lovable guy who is really invested in strategic competitive gaming. Erik, welcome to the No Frauds Club. Let's start by talking about strategic elements in games. We started a little bit before even pushing the record button here, talking about RTS games specifically. What do you really like about RTS games from a strategic sense? What speaks to you about games that have strategic components to how competitors find success?
I think honestly, the thing that probably appealed to me for RTS games from the very beginning goes all the way back to like when I was a kid, when I was playing with GI Joes and all that, and like my brother always had like the GI Joe side, and I would always get the Cobra side, and like nobody really thought of each other as good guys and bad guys, but we just wanted to like, almost differentiate our factions in an RTS style, and so then we'd be moving our, units around, we'd be moving our action figures around and their vehicles and all that kind of stuff. And drawing this picture of a greater battle that was going on, right? So then you fast forward a couple of years and we're playing Warcraft 1 on DOS, Warcraft 2. Then I remember borrowing my friend's StarCraft CD and playing that on my dad's computer. And so it was kind of like taking that concept that you enjoy as a child, playing with those action figures and imagining these greater battles, to then being able to take direct control over, virtual battles like that. And then, as you get older, you start to kind of like appreciate the complexities in terms of the competitive side of it and all that. And so I think honestly it's just kind of a natural progression of that, is that you imagine yourself as this commander taking control of these forces, and you get to feel like this big brain general, and it's just a fun like play fantasy to have. And then as you get older and add the really cool competitive complexity to it, it just becomes all the more appealing as an adult as well. So I think that's where it all comes from originally.
One of the games you referenced there is StarCraft. The original Brood War is where a lot of the people who are involved in my game design aficionado stuff, the No Frauds Club writ large as a game development firm, is basically we're just an indie team that are trying to build RTS games and games that are influenced by RTS games. And Brood War is the biggest one for sure. You mentioned that. Yeah, you mentioned that the big brain general is like a nice fantasy to live out in video games, and not even necessarily in just video games. But one of the things that speaks to me there is the idea that, you can have different factions and you can, explore different strategic elements or avenues, but an RTS is hard, right? RTS games are really hard to implement. So do you have any thoughts on like, games that are, you're consulting for Sunspear, we're putting together Immortal Gates of Pyre, for example. And do you have any thoughts on games that are approaching it from a more like accessibility oriented or like ease of use, newcomer friendly type of sort of approach in general? Do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to make RTS games more applicable? Or do you think it should just be staying as a hardcore sort of only, like tough gamers only? What do you think?
I think it depends, right? I mean, and I think honestly, like that's a decision that's up to the game developer, right? And like you mentioned, I do consult for Sunspear as a member of their community leadership advisory board. So we talk a lot about how to build community around the game. I also do play tests with the devs and kind of offer feedback from an esports perspective in that. And some bit from a player, but I never consider myself a game designer per se. Maybe someday, but like I don't want to put myself in that camp because I've never designed a game, right? But as far as that goes, I think you can really go both ways, and I think there's room for both. I do think that the esports world has been looking for a new 1v1 sort of game. I think people are kind of burning out on team games at this point. And you do see that cycle, of course, in what people prefer to play, in a competitive sense. And we went through that 1v1 cycle, and now we went through this team cycle, and I feel like we're kind of going back into a 1v1 cycle. But it may end up being something more balanced, right? Where there's 1v1s, there's smaller scale team things, 2v2, 3v3. But as far as the question of accessibility versus being hardcore, I think you can do both. I know that's what Sunspear is trying to do, where their concept, and they've said this publicly many times, of course, that they want to lower the skill floor, so make it easier for people to get in and enjoy the game, but maintain a high skill ceiling. So that means like at the top level, there's still a lot of mechanical ability that can be shown off by the top pros, right? And that's a great balanced approach, I think. And if you want to make a successful video game company that is profitable, that's probably a good way to go. That said, on the flip side of that, there's still always going to be a community that really wants that hardcore experience. You can still definitely excel in that community as well. It's always going to be smaller. It's always going to be more niche. So I'm sure as a developer, you have to kind of accept that. You have to kind of accept the community that's going to probably naturally come along with your game. I think of it too in sort of card game terms, where I've lately just become obsessed with this card game called Flesh and Blood, which is probably the most complex, difficult, competitive, hardcore 1v1 card game on the planet right now. And it's not for everyone. Like, the game mechanics are easy to learn, but then you look at the cards that are involved in your deck, and the learning curve just goes like this, right? It's like a learning cliff, and it takes a special kind of person to want to climb that cliff, and you're going to fall off a bunch of times on the way, right? But I love that. I love that experience of, like, I played a new deck last night of a new archetype that I hadn't played before, and my mind was just broken. I was like, how in the world do I play this? Like, I know this deck is good, but I can't figure out how to make it work. And like, so over the course of 3 or 4 games, I just got crushed over and over and over again. I started to learn, and I really enjoyed the whole process. And so I like that kind of hardcore experience, but that's definitely something that would be very frustrating for other gamers. So it kind of depends. I think both are valid choices, but there's obviously, going to be theoretical consequences that come with those.
There's a lot of parity between the conceptual space of card games where you have this deck, and the deck is basically your tool set, and you can leverage the tool set in specific ways. So there's a combination between what tools do you have and how do you execute with them. That speaks a lot to the RTS design as well. From where I'm standing, I imagine you could imagine tech trees and the units that you have and the buildings that you have as, in fact, the same sort of approach. That's your deck of cards.
Yeah.
How do you use that, right? And what order? You have the choice of what order you draw them in, right? So it's not quite as random as just a shuffled deck, but there's an element there.
Somewhat, it still is a shuffled deck, but what's in that deck, so you can, how much of something you've drawn, how much of something is less. So you do have knowledge of what's going to come up in theory that you can kind of capitalize on. And the best card games have decks that can execute very consistent strategies, and that is all about how fast you can cycle through the deck, how much you can search through the deck, that kind of thing. The Star Wars customizable card game from the late 90s, I don't know if you ever played that or anything like that, but there's still a community out there for the game. But that is I think, in my opinion, the best card game ever made. And it does operate in a very RTS fashion. You put out cards that are locations throughout the game, and then you put characters at locations and move them around. They can board and fly starships around, things like that. So there is a very RTS sort of element to that card game. But the way you cycle through your deck very quickly, and you have unlimited hand size too, so you can just have these massive hands, lets you execute very specific strategies. So they can print cards that say, like, if Luke has his lightsaber card, and at this Tatooine location, you get to do this, which is way too specific for like any other card game, but because you're able to go through your deck as quickly as you can in this game, and it recycles through, you're able to set up those scenarios consistently, and so you can kind of do a lot of fun things with that too. So it is very. I agree. There are card games out there. I think Star Wars is the number one example that I have a lot of RTS like qualities.
Right, yeah. And when I think of tech trees too, from a design perspective, I'm kind of thinking about, like, it's really funny you mentioned this with the G.I. Joe example, because you're like, well, G.I. Joe and then Cobra, but what if they were different? And so you have very distinct, almost lines drawn between factions in that respect.
In our minds, they were different,
right?
That's the thing, is we saw them as I mean, in the cartoon, obviously they're bad guys and good guys. That's the dividing line. But we saw them as having different attributes too, as kids. So we kind of created our own factions in our minds, with this.
Yeah, and that's really cool, because I've always been a sucker for games that have that asymmetric balance. It's harder to do, but it seems to have been like it's emerged as, in terms of like Darwinian terms, right? That's the dominant one. That's the one that survived natural selection, because there were a number of games that were basically just like, oh, here's the faction, and they have like one difference from another faction at the high level, like their spellcaster is different. This is like Warcraft 1, Warcraft 2, but eventually people realize, oh, it's actually more fun if you can really feel like you're a different faction when you're playing as them, and that's part of the whole fantasy of a commander and all that. So
I feel like StarCraft 2, I mean, both StarCraft and StarCraft 2 did a very good job of that, where like the different factions had very different play styles, and you would find the one that fits best, and if you were a horrible human being, you'd pick Protoss. That's the obvious answer. That's the one that stands out the most to me anyway.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I'm getting Artosis vibes already, The Protoss players are just so low skill. One of the things I did want to talk with you about is, like, do you have like a favorite RTS race from any RTS game you've played? Does anything stick out to you in that respect? Like, it could be thematic, but I imagine it's probably going to be at least equal parts, like what you like about them from afar and also what you like about them when you're playing as them. Anything come to mind?
Yeah. I think I liked Terran and Zerg pretty equally in StarCraft 2, honestly. Protoss never really appealed to me, but Terran and Zerg, I would say, because I was masters with both of those. So I put pretty equal time into both of them, and like Zerg, I like because you have a lot of very quick moving stuff. But at the same time, I think at its best, it's a very macro focused faction. You're trying to expand and spread across the map as fast as you can, while also making these sort of like quick hit and run attacks on their tertiary bases, while also making up a big army at the same time, and playing very defensive on your side of the map. So there's just a lot going on. I like the complexity of Zerg. When I lived at the Gome TV house in 2011, I was mostly playing Terran, but then I sat down. Then Moro ended up, the Swedish, formerly Terran player, then swapped to Zerg player, ended up in the seat next to me at the house in the practice area. And so I was like, I'm switching to Zerg, and I'm just going to play as many games a day as Moro does, and I'm just going to study with him. And he helped me out a lot. And so then I became kind of a Zerg main at that point. So I guess maybe StarCraft 2 Zerg probably tips a little bit into my favorite, but I really love playing Marine Marauder medevac style in Terran, which I guess is another kind of quick hit and run style. And I like doing Banshee harass and all that. I like very like micro focused play styles. So I guess Terran is more for me that stylistically, and then Zerg has that element, but then also really forces you to be good on the macro side too. So I don't know. I like both. It's hard to pick.
Sure, yeah. One of the things you mentioned is that you were masters in both of those races. Why do you think, I mean, the obvious answer that jumps out to me to this question is that it's just too much time. But why do you think that RTS competitors don't put a lot of time into getting maybe not equally as good, but good enough in that? Because, a bit of a spoiler for those following the development of our stuff is that we're going to have at the end of the development, which is going to take a while, we're going to use expansion packs to release these. We will have 20 playable factions, and they all will be unique. And so the idea of having people, there's thoughts of maybe having a League of Legends style pick ban where you actually do get to, restrict or maybe you have the order, maybe there's no bans, but you just see picks. And so there's a pick order of your factions. And so in that sense, you can actually come up with a team composition of of RTS factions in that respect. We're going to try to push the idea that, you should be good at least, competent at like 3 or 4 of these factions at a time. Why do you think that's not the case in, more conventional competitive RTS games like StarCraft 2, for example?
Well, I think some of the things you mentioned are true with that, where you're not really going to be thinking of the factions in that same context. But I think a part of it as well is when you've only got 3 factions in the game, then if you aren't super specializing in your thing, somebody else is going to be super specializing in their thing. And so it's much easier to know the matchups for one faction than for 2 factions, right? So if you're a pro player that's trying to maximize your potential to win tournaments, obviously you're going to like hyper focus onto one thing and just be a master of that. And we did see pros now and then play random. I think, wasn't it Flash who swapped random pretty famously a year or two ago? But I mean, like, that's Flash. Like, what else does he have to do in Broodware, right? Like, he's like conquered the game in every other conceivable way, right? So that's just like the last frontier for Flash, right? But like, I think if you're most pros, if you're not Flash, which 99.99999% of us are not Flash, it's going to be much more logical, both from a playing perspective and both from a intent to succeed financially as a pro player perspective, to just hyper focus on one race. It just makes a lot more sense.
Do you think then that it would just be an ill-advised direction potentially to try to push players down that road? Because from where we're standing, like that, it almost seems obvious that you would try to grab a couple of different, at least understand. Maybe your faction again doesn't get banned out because we're still not sure if we're going that route. But and theoretically, if your faction works really well with one team comp, and then your team, because you're random in matchmaking with 3v3 or something, your team picks something that doesn't synergize well, it pays to have something else. So do you think it's just a lack of incentives, or do you think fundamentally it's actually not a good idea? What's your take on that?
Oh, I don't think it's a bad idea. But and I mean, if you've got that many fully fleshed out factions, which sounds like an enormous amount of work, so if you can do it, more power to it, but to you. But yeah, I think I don't think it's a bad idea, but I do think you need to incentivize players to want to do it. Obviously, if you don't, then they won't. At the end of the day. So I think part of it is I think map design plays into that a lot. Where you're going to have maps that are just really trash for like some races, and then really great for like other ones if you've got that many of them in the game. So if a tournament uses X amount of maps, that might incentivize people to play X amount of different factions. But at the end of the day, like, yeah, you need to you need to make people want to do that. Otherwise, they definitely won't, you know? So how you do that, I think it's always a good idea to avoid bans if you can, you know? But I don't think there's anything wrong with bans per se if that's going to end up being like the best, way to sort of like make that happen. But it's better to make players, I think, want to do something than just like restrict them from doing something or allow them to restrict their opponents from doing something, because at the end of the day too, as a viewer, looking at it from the esports perspective, you want to see X player on their, in a League of Legends sense, you want to see them on their best champion, right? And so if that champion is just always banned, then it doesn't matter if they're the best player in the world at that because you never get to see them on it. So you need to be able to allow players to show themselves at their very best too somehow. So it's kind of a complicated dance, but banning is, I would say, kind of like a last resort option, which is what a lot of developers get to, for a lot of good reasons. But I've always seen that is something that you try to avoid if possible.
Yeah, and I feel like famously, I've followed League of Legends more heavily in the early, first 5 or 6 years of its esports running time, and so famously, that was something that happened with Faker. Is that the only time he got to play LeBlanc when I really started looking at the Korean scene was in that MSI where EDG tried to draft a comp around the fact that LeBlanc was open, for example, and that's the one loss that he accrued on that around that era. So it does feel like there's a lack of, like, you're almost, I won't say you're ruining history, that might be a bit hyperbolic, but there's an element where it's like we never got to see as much, we never got to see the other teams be pushed to really counter it. We never got to see, teams other than EDG really look to build around that because they could just push the ban button, right? So there is almost an element where like you do deprive the viewer and also the player of like witnessing a legacy in that respect, don't you think?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, that's just kind of something that comes with the territory. But it's something to think about, I think, from a development perspective that hasn't been thought about as much. And some of that is also just the straight up objective power of that champion or faction. If it is just very powerful already, it's going to be drawing more bans, anyway. And then if somebody's extra good on it, then then you're never going to get to see them play that. So part of that's kind of a balance thing too, where sometimes it's that combination of objective strength, objective high levels of strength plus player ability. So that, yeah, there's a lot to think about when it goes to that. But yeah, ideally you're going to want to create scenarios you can see like the best player playing, the players playing with their best at, right? And so whether that's OGN had a blind pick round, if it got to the tiebreak, I think there was blind pick, and there's definitely issues with that too. But it did allow players to play their best champions, which fans liked. It was good from that perspective. So maybe like one round in a tournament could be like blind pick in that regard too, where people could just pick whatever they wanted, right? And what the person's going to play, and then you have to kind of like as their opponent find out a way to try to counter that as best you can.
Yeah, there's something really thematic about I'm putting myself in the shoes of, for example, Ryu in that famous ZvZ matchup, right? And I'm
Sure.
thinking like, okay, I've picked this champion, and now I'm pretty sure the way the UI worked is that you didn't see who your enemy team picked unless the last
you had
10
no idea
seconds
until
or
you loaded
something,
in.
right? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
the loading screen is even worse because then you load in and you see Faker Zed, and it's like, damn, like, what am I gonna? There's something really powerful about like providing the opportunity for competitors themselves to like use leveraging aspects of the game, maybe subtle ones like what I'm talking about here, just to like
Mhm.
almost mind fuck their opponent, don't you think? Like there's some really cool
Well, I
element
think
about that.
the thing people don't recall with that particular series too, the 2013, summer finals between SKT and KT, is that uh, there wasn't like a clearly definitive better Zed player out of the two of them at that point. Ryu is still widely considered, one of the best, if not the best mid laner in Korea. Faker really, Faker was in that same conversation too, but it was really that moment where he sort of like seized the crown, and then like didn't give it up for years, right? So, at that point, I think they both kind of probably expected that the other was going to pick Zed, but I don't think Ryu was like, well, he's probably going to be better than me. I think he believed that he would be, and I think at that point, if they played a bunch of different games, I think Ryu would have definitely won some of those games in that ZvZ. So that's part of it too, is that in that particular context, who was truly the best hadn't quite been decided yet.
Right. Well, there's plenty of room for like the one of the things that was really good about Zed in that era in general of League of Legends is that there was a lot of potential for mechanical outplay. Obviously, the series itself
Yeah, it was a
demonstrated that
great
in
champion.
spades.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to get your sort of pick your brain about things in like, okay, so in Brood War obviously is a very mechanically driven game. It's kind of hard to tell though, if you're not initiated, what is a mechanical outplay in that game versus what is just a garden variety right click or something to that effect. And another thing that Brood War leverages is that certain bugs were just whitelisted and said, yeah, you can use these, and that's stuff like the drone glitching and like the worker stacking and stuff. And so one of the things that I keep thinking about is it's tempting for many people who I think aren't familiar with how Blizzard would later go on to balance a lot of their games. It's tempting for them to say, why doesn't Blizzard just like fix this, but make it so that, or like formally instantiate this as a behavior in that respect. And maybe they don't need to do this in some of these cases I brought up specifically, but it does feel like for the average fan, they're like, why is there a bug that a player is using in like the premier ASL match of the day or something like that? It's like, there's a lot of convincing you have to do to get to somebody on board, a lot of educating that they have to do, even as a viewer. And the elitist in me really likes that, because that means that you have to you only get the people who are super invested. But the realist in me also recognizes if you only get the people that are super invested or are willing to climb the big the skill cliff you described there, but in information terms, then yeah, you're going to limit the number of people who can get excited for the game that's at hand. And if it's the best game, if you believe it's the best game, then surely it should have the best fanfare as well. So what do you think about trying to present a clear picture in an RTS or even a MOBA terminology? Because it does seem to me like this is almost not an unsolvable problem, but one that doesn't have perfect solutions by any means, is trying to show the audience how skillful something actually was.
Sure. I mean, I think part of it is just the evolution of game design on that front in general. Because, like you mentioned, a lot of those things like drone drilling and all that kind of stuff, like in Brood War, were mechanics, or you could look at like wave dashing in Smash Melee, right? These are like mechanics that weren't intended, but were discovered and became a core component of competitive play, right? And so I think what game developers can learn from that is looking at those types of mechanics and saying, hey, let's just include those games let's just include those types of things intentionally in our game, where it's like lesser known interactions that don't affect the core gameplay per se from a casual perspective. Like you can like never know this exists and still have fun with the game, but at the high level it gives kind of extra cool things to be like discovered and used. And in StarCraft 2, you could still click a mineral and have your, workers go through, units as well, right? So that was something that was, probably not intended in the initial game. At least I don't think it was, but it's something that they then intentionally included in StarCraft 2 as a gameplay element. So I think that's a good example of developers kind of learning from that and then saying, hey, that's pretty cool. Let's just make it part of the game. That's okay, right? And if new players never discover it, it's not the hugest deal ever. But at the pro level, it's something that can be very impactful and fun. Um, in terms of watching it, in terms of kind of like showing that stuff, uh, RTSs are nice in that it's very easy to understand Army A fights Army B on the screen, and you see them eliminate each other, right? You see units dropping, you see one army, staying big and the other one getting smaller. Like visually, it's very easy to see and easy to appreciate what's happening in a battle in an RTS. MOBAs are obviously a lot harder, right? Because people don't know what all the abilities do necessarily. And so they don't know the impact of somebody being hit by X ability, right? Where it might be huge if you know, but that might not be totally visually represented on the screen in a meaningful way, right? But on the RTS side of things, I guess it's I kind of lost my train of thought a little bit, but I think the main thing is that you don't necessarily need to know all those mechanics right away as a viewer. I don't think everything should be discoverable purely by watching. And I always use my wife, who's from South Korea, learning how to watch American football, where she and I would watch that when we were over there, because I would get up at 4 a.m. to watch the Packers, and because that's when it's live in America. And the first time she watched that game, it was totally incomprehensible, right? There's these big long lines of guys, they run into each other. There's a ball that's somewhere, but it's not really very easy to see if you don't know where to look for it. And like, why are they throwing it sometimes? Why are they running it sometimes? Why are they kicking it sometimes? What does touchdown even mean? That word like doesn't make any sense in a regular English sense, right? Because they're not like touching it. I mean, in the old days, you would touch it down in the end zone, right? That's why it's called a touchdown. But nowadays, you can just dive in, and as long as it crosses the line, you're in, right? So the meaning of that word in a literal sense has been lost over time, even within the game itself. So I had to explain these things to her. I had to be like, oh well, when you kick a field goal, that you get 3 points. When you get a touchdown, you get 6 points, but then you get a chance to kick it. But this time, it's only worth 1 point. And like that's all very unintuitive stuff. And in the US, we grow up learning this as kids, so it doesn't sound weird. But for someone like her who is in her, late 20s, it was very, hard to understand. But she was gracious enough to watch enough games with me that over the course of, I'd say probably 4 or 5 games, like half a season or so, she got it and she got into it. And now she really loves watching football with me. So when I look at it from the esports side of things too, the expectation that everyone should be able to understand everything that's going on right away without having anyone there helping explain it to him, I think is irrelevant. That's a moot point to me. I mean, name a sport where you're going to understand absolutely everything the first time you watch it. Like, that just doesn't exist. So the idea that we should hold esports to this standard, has never made sense to me. So I'm not too worried about that, honestly. I think uh, you need to be able to sort of grasp in a broad sense what's going on. I mean, if you look at football again for an example, one team is trying to get to this end of the field. That's obvious, right? And something happens at one of those ends of the field that gives them points. So you understand that when somebody makes a long run that direction, that's a good thing, right? Just like in StarCraft 2, you might not really understand what's going on in the bases, but when one army beats another army, that's a good thing for the army that won, right? So as long as the game includes those obvious broad elements of, this thing is a good thing for this player and a bad thing for this player, then all the other stuff, as long as the game is engaging enough visually, you can learn that other stuff over time. So I've never been as concerned about that as a lot of other people seem to be in esports, I guess.
It's really interesting that you bring up the example of, you sort of educating your wife on football in that respect, because it's what's really interesting to me is the idea that, a lot of people who watch esports, especially if they're just checking it out by themselves. I mean, the key is by themselves, right? They're for the first time. Maybe they don't have a community of people who've linked them to them, or they're on a Discord call hanging out, looking at the same thing or whatever.
Right.
That does happen, but it does seem like the majority of it are probably just some people who've stumbled upon it and they don't have anybody to explain it to them, except that's where the casters can maybe come in and offer some of that. And you're very familiar with that role. Do you think that that was ever, like you said earlier, you weren't ever super concerned about that? And especially in League of Legends, you had the luxury of casting in Korea where you actually could just like assume that everybody watching was watching because they were really invested in the game and specifically competition at the highest level, right? So is that something that you think, like, is that a role for casters, or do you actually think it's better if casters can just focus more heavily on, commentating for the people who are already initiated in that respect? What's your take on the caster role of like being the friend in the living room that educates you on how the game is?
I think it depends on. I think you need to know your audience. So to use LCK as an example, we knew that our audience tended to be more of the hardcore fans who, like you were saying, were coming into it already knowing the game. So we didn't feel as much burden to sort of like baby people, as it were, and explain kind of the basic things. That said, I do think that like the LCS, which is on prime time in English speaking, US, and you've got like Overwatch League. Monty and I, casted that. For that, we did make a point of explaining some of the more basic stuff, and or at least presenting complex things in a way that people who are uninitiated could grasp them. And because we knew it in those cases with those broadcasts, we would have more people watching who were new to it, right? Where you're not going to get a lot of new League of Legends players watching LCK, but you are going to get a lot of new people watching Overwatch League or watching LCS, or something like that. So I think as a commentator, the main thing to know is to understand who your audience is, what the level they're coming at is, and then tailor things on that side of things. And I think people like to distill it down to like, oh, you have to dumb down the broadcast, right? And you really don't. You just need to find better ways to clearly and concisely explain complex concepts. And that's difficult, but it's obviously worth the effort, and I think that's what we always try to do. And that's what I still try to do is make my broadcasting accessible without, just totally ignoring all the complex things. Like there are ways to explain that in a simple way. You just need to find them, right? And that's part of the job. That's part of the work, I guess.
Speaking of complex things, I wanted to contrast Brood War with the sequel, because in the schools of people who are really big aficionados of Brood War, as you're probably familiar, they do tend to revile the sequel and say, "Oh, StarCraft 2 is, never the game that it could have been, or what have you." One of the things that I wanted to drill down on was specifically when, like, so we talked earlier about from a design perspective, you want to avoid bans if you can, because then you're like restricting choices. It is not a clean comparison, but one example of something that is intrinsic to StarCraft 2's competitive play that I think it was experimented a few times with removing, but not with great results, was the macro mechanics. So this would be like Larva Inject or Mule or Chrono Boost in some ways. And since you're a Zerg aficionado as well from StarCraft 2, you might know this. Obviously, if you don't do your Larva Injects, you fall behind. And assuming you're fighting an opponent who's also keeping up with their stuff, there's an opportunity cost to not using it. What do you make of how that specific example morphed your understanding of Zerg or the competitive meta around it? Because from my perspective, thinking more as a game developer and less as a player, I look at that and think, well, you're kind of just forcing the player to push buttons on cooldown, and there's not an interesting decision to be made. Is that an oversimplification? Is there actually a more interesting, is there more nuance to how you, like which one you inject with Larva? Because it always looked to me like you just always inject as many as you can and keep the queens next to your hatcheries. What's your take on stuff like that?
I think that's the general gist of it, is that you always want to have larvae, injected as soon as you possibly can, right? Because the more larvae you have, the more, units you can make, right? In terms of workers or in terms of, fighting units. So for me, it's clear that like if you're playing StarCraft 2 at a casual level, you don't need to master injecting, right? Because you're never going to get past like silver and gold, and the casual players don't really care about that anyway. They might not even be playing competitive, right? So in that sense, the burden of doing that on cooldown to maximize Zerg macro doesn't really matter, right? Because your casual player isn't going to care. Now, me, who was trying to be the best player I could possibly be, I took the time to, set up like vision hotkeys, like learn my like finger rolls to like cycle through the bases and inject, like super fast. Like I inject 5 bases in like 2 seconds, something like that. And like that for me, because I was trying to play at a very high level, was worth it to learn. Now, did that make the game better in a competitive sense that I had to learn that? I don't think so. I don't think that made the game better as a competitive game that I had to learn that thing to be good, I think you could just as easily say, well, larvae are injecting automatically, you still have the burden of using them to make things, but now you've got this extra sort of mental real estate to think about, flanking and more complex attacks on your opponent, which to me is a more interesting aspect of the game than just kind of the busy work. So while I don't think there's anything wrong to have that in there, I don't think having things like that in there, or for instance, taking out multiple building select, I don't think that level of that type of difficulty makes a game better competitively. It just kind of creates busy work, and sure, I mean, you can have respect for people that can master the busy work, and that is part of appreciating what pro gamers in StarCraft Brood War and what StarCraft 2 can do, is you have mastered that busy work. But does it make the game better competitively? I don't think it does, so that's why like I never had an issue with MBS and StarCraft 2 and all that kind of stuff, because it's like it's just busy work, right? I would rather see players using their mental bandwidth to think about doing cool things strategically than just being like, oh, I need another supply depot, oh, I need to, click this barracks and then this barracks and then this barracks, it's like, yeah, I appreciate the effort it takes to learn that stuff, and that's really impressive that these players have done that, but it's not necessary for that to be in a game to be a good competitive game.
Right. I mean, this speaks to me pretty deeply because we made the decision to just remove supply because ultimately it
Mm.
was just busy work, right? And, unlimited selection doesn't hurt the game in the same sense that many people, I think, erroneously argued for it. Because I think what a lot of people who were these Brood War diehards and thought that, you can't diverge from Brood War or else you'll jeopardize the competitive integrity of the game or something.
Mm.
People who were correctly observing, I think, that the whole skill floor versus skill ceiling thing might have been out of whack in StarCraft 2 by comparison to Brood War. And so it was a very different game already.
Yeah. Like MBS is not part of the skill ceiling. Like,
yes, yeah.
let's be clear on this. Like larva injects, MBS, like that does not contribute to the skill ceiling. Like that doesn't make you a more skillful player as a strategist in Brood War, which is what we're really measuring people by. How good of a strategist and micromanager are they, And so MBS doesn't make you a better strategist, or not having it doesn't make you a better strategist.
You mentioned specifically not worrying as much about like, you have the mental clarity. I think of this as like APM is a resource and you can only spend it on so many things, no matter what your APM cap is. And so yeah, the players, you can sort of pass the buck to the players and say, get better APM, higher APM so you can do more things. But if you as a designer allow for more interesting strategies to be made instead, or more interesting decisions to be made instead, I think that's where you get the money. And that's where it's
Yeah.
like, dragoons in Brood War spinning up cliffs or down cliffs and not really being able to make the path. Like,
Yeah.
is it really interesting that, and that's another example too of the whole esports viewer overhead. It's like, why are everybody so excited that he got 3 dragoons up the ramp? I don't understand. It's like, yeah, if you don't know that
Yeah.
dragoons are so bad at pathing, then you wouldn't know that, right? So, but setting aside that element, it's just like, it's not interesting to have to micromanage your dragoons up a cliff. It's
Well, I will say, let me interrupt for a second and say, like, that's part of the charm of Brood War, though. That's part of the thing where people know it's like dumb and it shouldn't be in the game, but it's kind of like it's something. It's a bonding point for the community, right? So like those types of things, like they do have some redeeming value, and that is it's a charming aspect of the game, but definitely something that you don't want to include intentionally per se. So it's not totally without value, but it's definitely not a necessary thing, or not. I wouldn't say it's something that is good about Brood War per se.
right. And furthermore, it's like if you could instead have something better, then that would obviously be an upgrade, right? So, like, if instead of
Sure.
dragoons being weirdly inflexible with their paths, if there was something more positional to them, like one of the things that we experimented with pretty early on in our phase is like if you're up on a cliff, instead of having a random chance to miss the attack from somebody coming from below the ground, you instead just get more range to attack somebody on the low ground. So there's an
Hmm.
advantage to being on the upper cliff that doesn't materialize as like an obvious disadvantage for the person who's engaging with the high ground unit, if that makes
Right.
sense. So you're more like you make this decision to get a benefit, not to lose something out, right? Like you're not making this decision to
Yeah.
make your opponent's life more annoying or something.
Well, in StarCraft 2 is just purely vision, right? You just lacked vision if you didn't have anything up on the high ground. So that's how they handled it. And as far as the supply conversation goes, you've got Immortal tying supply to production buildings, which makes a lot of sense. That you can still have supply in the game, but you're going to be making things that are going to be automatically like upping it anyway. Because as you take more bases, you're going to want more production buildings, and so it's kind of the supply kind of grows organically with it too. Does a RTS need to have supplies as part of the element in the game? Maybe, maybe not. I haven't thought a lot about it. I think I think it might be important in circumstances where you create a faction that can produce a lot of things very quickly without any sort of supply cap. Then that theoretically that faction could outpace others in a negative way for gameplay. Um, but honestly, I haven't given much thought to it. It doesn't bother me that supplies in the game, but I think it is cool that on the immortal side they just tied it into production buildings, right? So they just kind of made it, something that's there, and you do have to pay attention to it, but you're getting this benefit of also being able to produce more units simultaneously while you're increasing this supply. So it's an interesting take on it.
Right, yeah, and I suppose it also adds a lot more value to destroying somebody's production facility because then you could
Yeah, it makes that
theoretically
that
block
hit more
them.
meaningful for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes it more dramatic when you lose buildings, whereas like in StarCraft, Brood War and StarCraft 2, like yeah, sure you do lose more simultaneous production capability, but it I guess it doesn't have quite the same hit. It's not it is more impactful, I guess, if there's supply tied to it. But maybe that's another reason not to, too. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it that much, but now that I am, I'm thinking about all these different perspectives on
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Well, one of the things that we came to a conclusion of is through playing our own sort of prototypes. It's like if we lose, 30 supply structures because we had to put them all in, well, we didn't have to put them all in one spot, but we put them all in one spot because it's just like a chore that we have to do, and then they all get wiped by somebody who sneaks like a nuke there or something. It's like, well, now I can't play the game because I can't train more units until I rebuild
Mhm.
them all. So maybe that's just GG, and that's a very unsatisfying way to lose is our knee jerk reaction. But then we think a bit deeper about that sort of thing before we make a decision to cut it. But it's like, there's a lot of elements that I think it backfires on the player. It constrains the choices that they can make in certain elements where I think you can get for lack of a better term, you can kind of get like a cleaner flow chart almost of things to do if you're not, lining up time and 100 minerals for a depot every, say,
Yeah.
30 seconds or something
I
to that
do
effect.
really like the way that supply depots worked in StarCraft 2 and that they kind of became like gateway buildings too, with the ability to like raise and lower them. So, you could still definitely include that type of building that was purely just sort of a gate building without attaching supply to it, so there's that. But I do like, at least in StarCraft 2, they attached interesting things with the supply, right? Zerg could scout with their supply, right? Protoss could create forward bases with a lot of power very quickly with their supplies. So at least with the supply buildings in StarCraft 2, or supply units, I guess in the Zerg case, there was interesting game mechanics attached to that. But I think you could just as easily use those mechanics independently of attaching them to supply too. So
One of the things that I wanted to touch on here is balancing from an RTS perspective. It doesn't necessarily have to be limited to RTSs, but since we're talking about that
sure.
primarily throughout this whole talk, I figured that would be a nice point to anchor it to. And when I think of Brood War, obviously everybody's like, what balancing? Because there's no patches. And you compare that to
One every
StarCraft
10
2.
years or so, you know.
Yeah. If you compare that to StarCraft 2, like there was a period of time where there were patches very frequently, and I think even towards the end of its patch cycle, it was surmised in a blog post from the devs that they were going to basically go down the road of like changing it for the sake of change, which I've
Mhm.
always had an aversion to from a development standpoint, but I can see the
Yeah.
reasons why they laid it out was basically to keep things fresh. What do you think about, like, these are basically completely divergent directions, but they're in the same franchise? It's kind of a unique comparison in gaming, is that,
Mhm.
you have the game that, like you said earlier, the Dragoons, that's part of the charm. And part of the reason why you can say it's part of the charm is because it's not changing. It's super inflexible. Like, you just, like, in this sense, the developers are basically like the benevolent dictators, and they just choose what happens, and
Yeah. They're
there's
not
no
fixing it
changing
anytime
it.
soon, yeah.
Right. And so you compare that to the StarCraft
Yeah.
2 approach, and it's like, flavor of the month maybe, or flavor of the 3 months, depending on how often it was. And there's always the long-standing time of, like, Broodlord Infester for Zerg for, earlier in the game's history, for example. And so there's all these
Well, that was a
elements.
dark time.
Yeah.
That was the early days, Heart of the Swarm. That did need to get changed, yeah.
Right. And so maybe sometimes they take a little bit too long for stuff like that. What do you think
Mhm.
about the approaches that developers, I guess we're mostly focusing on Blizzard here, but you could extend this to Riot with League, or, I guess with Valorant as well, although that's a little bit younger. What do you think about the approaches that developers have had for balancing their esports games? And, like, have you seen a favorite method of yours? Have you seen one that just seems to work better? Like, I guess we could go specific. What do you think about the StarCraft 2 approach?
I have always thought that I've always liked the idea of going longer between balance patches in things like that. And I've done a lot of teamfight tactics over the last couple of years in terms of casting, and then just playing. I've been masters in TFT every set since set 2 at one point or another, and and they patch that game every 2 weeks usually. Which is, even small changes are meta defining in that game. So it's like every 2 weeks you have to figure out the meta again. And I don't think that's great on the competitive side. I think, because for two reasons. One is that if you want to be competitive in the game, you feel like you're starting over every 2 weeks, basically, to a more or lesser degree, depending on the patch. And then the other thing, too, is that there's very little room for innovation in that people aren't having to work hard to sort of counteract the popular strategies. And teamfight tactics works a lot like StarCraft does. It works a lot like an RTS. I've always joked and called it like reverse StarCraft, because you're using all your high APM during the macro phase, where you're doing a lot of scouting, you're doing a lot of repositioning, you're buying and selling, you're trying to improve your board, you're rolling and all that. And then in the battles, you're not doing anything, obviously, because it's an auto battler, right? But it's got those a lot of similar elements. There's early game, mid game, late game. There's different tech to consider in those phases of the game. So there's a lot of RTS elements in a game like Teamfight Tactics. So because you've got all those tools, I don't like that it's patched every 2 weeks. Occasionally you get something where it's like, all right, something's just way too strong, clearly, and it needs to be nerfed because it's overpowering the meta. But at the same time, you look at the history of Brood War, there were points where people perceived the game to be that way, and then players were able to innovate and find ways around it that, shook things up, right, without needing a patch. What I'd kind of like to see is developers patch less, but put a greater emphasis on finding community content that contests the perceived meta and promoting that. I think the key is, if you don't want to patch a lot and you want players to innovate, you need, as a company, I think, in this age of social media and sharing, you need to, as a company, promote players that are innovating, and get people to not just accept the meta as it is, but to kind of like try to change the meta in the way they want it to be, right? Try to push the boundaries, right? Because I think the other thing this does too is that if you really push sort of meta breaking strategies, whether they're great or not, if they're innovative, that's great. is you also take away, I think, the perception that this thing is strong and you just got to play this thing and that's it. Don't think about any other stuff, right? So I think rather than patch it and change the numbers, promote people with innovative ideas and get the community thinking that it's a good thing to innovate rather than just complain about what's strong, right? So I think there's a community approach to it too that needs to be looked at. So the game can be balanced. Some games I think can be balanced from by the community in terms of gameplay, how people approach it themselves as players, rather than actually changing the numbers in the game with a software patch, right? So that's an aspect of game balance that hasn't been explored, I think, enough in a lot of competitive games right now. It's
Right.
promoting innovation.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, one of the things that this makes me think about is like, in Brood War, that basically is what happens. It has to be. I mean, there's maps that also
Exactly.
will
Yeah.
change it, yeah, but a lot of the times it's like you might see an era of one race being kind of dominant in a specific matchup, and then that's followed with maybe the maps help this, maybe they don't. Somebody comes up with a strategy that counters that, and it is like community balancing, but without the software itself changing. You used to run the same
Yeah.
patch, but because you found a strategy that works, that can be really empowering for the end user, because then they know, like, okay, even though this seems impossible, they almost have faith that there's a way to find an answer to that. And
Right.
yeah, a hallmark
In a
of
game as big as StarCraft 2 and as big as Brood War and as big as TFT, like there are options out there. There's exceptions to that. Sometimes there are going to be things that are just straight up too strong, but most of the time things are not as black and white meta-wise as people perceive them to be.
we're coming up on time, so I wanted to give you the
Yeah.
opportunity to say any final words about any of the topics we talked about here, and plug
Sure.
anything that you feel like doing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can't plug anything at the moment because the things I'm going to be involved in haven't been announced yet. I've got a couple things coming up, some news next week already. So keep an eye on my Twitter, I guess, for that. GGDOA on Twitter. Yeah, just excited about doing more esports stuff. It was fun to nerd out and talk about game design theory for a little while. Like I said, I'm not a developer, but it's the philosophy of game design is something that's always been very interesting to me. So it's been fun to chat about it. Thanks for having me on.
We at the No Frauds Club thank DoA for his time. And if you're as excited about RTS games as we are, we invite you to stick around. Until next time.